Hey Global Village, what's up? As always, whenever I feel moved to create a video or just have a bit of a rant, the tension is between my desire to create the video in the first place, perhaps as just a mechanism for me to cathartically talk it out, against the other tension, which is, can I possibly do this justice? Can I articulate my thoughts clearly and concisely, given one take, no script, and the ocean of thoughts bouncing around my head? And of course, I know that I'm probably going to be unsatisfied and disappointed with my efforts, but I do the best I can. And in the end, I just need to talk about this stuff. So please believe me, I am being as sincere as I can, and I'm trying my best to state my case as lucidly and as clearly as possible under the circumstances. So the blind man doth speaketh his truth. Okay, so with that said, let's consider the official narrative here in the West of what is happening in Iran. So, according to official sources, what we are witnessing here is protesters out on the streets declaring their rage and their anger at a tyrannical government who is causing them to fall into poverty and ruin as their society collapses all around them. And in return, their government is brutalizing and murdering these poor protesters as they peacefully try to demonstrate in an effort to let the world know of their plight. So that more or less is kind of how it's being told to us here in the West. But what's the actual reality? Well, the reality is that the Iranian government is certainly not a democracy. However, just to highlight the hypocrisy here, let's take a look at Saudi Arabia, because it turns out Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarch. That is how it is officially described. And they have complete control over the population based on their religious doctrine. Now, Saudi Arabia has a long and storied history of human abuse, abuses against human rights, which have been well documented. But, nonetheless, the West has no problem with Saudi Arabia, and they are seen as a legitimate government. Whereas any Middle East country, or any country at all, in fact, that does not align with Western interests is invariably described as a regime. So there's some very obvious, almost farcical level of bias there in terms of the way countries are framed, depending on whether they align with Western interests or not. And Saudi Arabia is just the obvious example. Most of the Gulf states are monarchies. They are certainly not democracies, and in fact they're about the furthest thing away from a democracy as you could imagine. But nonetheless, it is Iran that we are told to focus on and to consider the true enemy of the people, and that there is genuine moral outrage at this particular regime, whilst nothing but the sound of crickets chirping when it comes to all the others. So what is actually happening in Iran? Well, it's complicated, because I believe there is certainly a pocket of the population that are protesting and genuinely feel they are aggrieved by the government. However, if that's all it was, this wouldn't be happening. Certainly not anything like to the degree that it is happening, because these are not peaceful protests. These are violent protests, including literally burning down government buildings and people armed with deadly weapons going out on the streets, engaging in gunfights with law enforcement, and indeed shooting other protests, or so it has been alleged. Now, let's just consider America and ICE, because we've seen what law enforcement does to protesters of ICE, whether or not they even have weapons at all. Apparently, if you do anything that may be regarded arguably as not the strict letter of the law, then you're liable to have your life taken from you. So it's rather bizarre to hear Trump complaining about the brutalization of the protesters when the protesters themselves are engaged not in peaceful protest but in violent protest, and it appears that it is being fomented by both America and Israeli interests, both in terms of providing intelligence to the protesters and also providing them with actual arms and weapons so that they can engage in this sort of level of actual violence. So the reality is that shortly after these protests were actually quelled down, there was an enormous counter-protest, if you like to call it that, which involved millions of Iranians demonstrating their actual support for the current and existing regime, as imperfect as it may be. Because the truth of the matter is, no matter the type and structure of the governing body in that country, no governing body, whether democratic or otherwise, could bring prosperity and wealth to a nation when they've undergone decades of massive and unrelenting sanctions, financial and diplomatic sanctions, cultural sanctions, isolating that country. So it's quite disingenuous for people to call for the liberation of these people when they are the very same people, or the governments of these people are the ones that have resulted in the bulk of the economic suffering of the people of Iran. So what I want to do is I'm just going to share a link with a recent interview with Professor Morandi on the Reason to Resist channel, because it's really good. And Professor Morandi does not, in my opinion, peddle in propaganda. There is an air of authenticity in his rhetoric, an air of just basic, this is how it is, and this is what is actually happening. Let's take a look under the covers, against the wave of propaganda that's sweeping over him and all of us. Specifically, he talks about a recent interview he had with Piers Morgan and how the dice were just massively loaded against him in a way that was demonstrably unfair and quite against the actual agreement that he had arranged with Piers Morgan prior to going on the show. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. Like I said, what is happening in Iran, the official narrative, is just so wrong in the basic flavour and intent of how we're supposed to understand it. Now, there is no perfectly, this is the good side, this is the bad side, but there is a far more honest and I think a view that's informed by someone who's willing to actually engage their brain and put 1 and 2 together to get 4, rather than just, uncritically swallowing the official narrative. Because I believe what's happening in Iran is mostly about Western imperialism. And indeed, that is the primary reason why Iran has continued to be treated as the great enemy and, in a regime of moral turpitude, when I believe this is simply not the case. All right, bendy out.